I've never told this story publicly before, and even now I'm not sure why I'm writing it. Maybe because enough time has passed. Maybe because carrying it around for years has become exhausting. For context, my name is William. I'm not looking for sympathy, and I'm definitely not trying to make myself sound smarter than I was. The truth is that I committed a crime that started with a single bank notification and ended up changing the way I see myself forever. At the time, I was 28, buried in debt, and constantly one unexpected expense away from disaster. My small freelance jobs barely covered rent. Collection agencies called almost daily. Every morning felt like waking up already behind. Then one Tuesday afternoon, while I was sitting in a coffee shop trying to figure out which bill I could afford to ignore that month, my phone buzzed. A transfer had arrived in my account. The amount was large enough to make my stomach drop. I checked the sender information 3 times. Nothing. No recognizable name. No company. No explanation. Just a completed transfer and a balance that suddenly looked very different from what it had looked like an hour earlier. At first I assumed it was a banking error. Then I convinced myself someone would notice within minutes and reverse it. But as the hours passed, the money stayed exactly where it was. Most people probably know the right thing to do in that situation. I knew it too. That's what makes what happened next so hard to admit. Because the moment I realized nobody was immediately taking the money back, another thought appeared in my head. What if I kept it? That question should have scared me. Instead, it excited me. And that was the beginning of everything. The transfer was still sitting in my account the next morning. I checked before I even got out of bed. Then again while making coffee. Then every hour after that. Nothing changed. No emails from the bank. No phone calls. No alert saying the transaction had been reversed. That should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. It felt like standing next to a bag of cash in the middle of a crowded street, waiting for someone to claim it. For 3 days I did absolutely nothing. I told myself I was being responsible, but the truth is I was studying the situation. I read banking forums, searched for stories about mistaken transfers, and tried to understand how long it usually took financial institutions to correct errors. The more I researched, the more dangerous my thinking became. I stopped asking, who does this money belong to? Instead, I started asking, how would someone move it without attracting attention? That shift mattered. It was the moment I went from being a confused recipient of a mysterious transfer to someone actively considering a crime. By the end of that week, the money had become impossible to ignore. I wasn't living comfortably back then. Every decision revolved around what I could postpone paying. Rent was late. My credit cards were nearly maxed out. Even grocery shopping felt like a math problem I was destined to fail. The transfer sat there like a solution to all of it. I remember opening my banking app late one night and staring at the balance in the dark. My apartment was silent except for the hum of an old refrigerator. That's when I made the decision I still regret. Not all at once, though. I told myself I was only going to test things. I came up with excuses that sounded reasonable in my head. Maybe the sender would never come forward, maybe the bank had already verified everything, maybe this was somehow legitimate. Deep down, I knew those were lies. The first time I used a small portion of the money, my hands were shaking. Nothing happened afterward. No warning. No phone call. And that silence made me bolder. Once I'd spent a small amount and nothing happened, my fear started turning into confidence. That was the dangerous part. I convinced myself that if the transfer had been a mistake, someone would have noticed by now. Instead of preparing to return the money, I began preparing to keep it. Looking back, that was when the crime truly started, not with the transfer itself, but with the choices I made afterward. I became obsessive. Every evening after work, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, mapping out possibilities. I tracked my account activity, monitored incoming messages, and checked for any signs that the bank was investigating the transaction. I avoided large purchases. I didn't want anything that might attract attention from friends or relatives. The goal was simple: blend in. At the same time, I started moving portions of the money between accounts I already controlled. Nothing dramatic, just small transfers spread over several days. Each successful step made me feel smarter. In reality, I was only digging myself deeper. About 2 weeks after the transfer arrived, I started believing I had gotten away with it. That confidence lasted exactly 1 day. I was at work when my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. Normally I ignored calls like that, but something told me to answer. The woman on the line introduced herself as a representative from my bank. The moment I heard those words, my stomach tightened. She asked a few routine questions about recent account activity. Nothing directly related to the transfer. Nothing accusatory. Still, every question sounded loaded to me. I answered carefully and tried to sound relaxed. When the call ended, I spent the rest of the afternoon unable to focus. My mind replayed every transaction I had made since the money appeared. Had I moved too much? Too quickly? Had someone finally noticed? That night I barely slept. The strange thing is that the bank never contacted me again. But the call changed everything. For the first time, I stopped feeling lucky and started feeling hunted. The days after that phone call were some of the most stressful of my life. Nothing actually happened, yet I felt as if everything was happening. Every email notification made my pulse jump. Every unknown number looked like trouble. I started checking my account history several times a day, searching for signs that the transfer had been flagged or reversed. Friends noticed I was distracted. One of them asked if I was having financial problems again. Ironically, money was the one thing I suddenly had. What I didn't have was peace of mind. Instead of stepping back and admitting what I'd done, I doubled down. I told myself that if I acted nervous, people would become suspicious. So I forced myself to behave normally. The effort was exhausting. At night I imagined different scenarios. Maybe the sender had already reported the missing funds. Maybe investigators were collecting information before contacting me. Maybe the bank was building a case. Most of those fears never materialized. But fear has a way of creating its own reality, and mine was growing stronger every day. About a month after the transfer appeared, something happened that scared me more than the bank's phone call. I received an email from a stranger. The message was short and strangely polite. The sender claimed that a substantial amount of money had been sent to the wrong account and asked whether I had recently received an unexpected transfer. No threats. No accusations. Just a question. I must have read it 20 times. My first reaction was panic. My second was suspicion. How did this person get my email address? Were they telling the truth? Was this some kind of trap designed to get me to admit what I'd done? For 2 days, I didn't respond. Instead, I obsessed over every possibility. I searched the sender's name online. I examined the email headers. I even convinced myself that investigators might be using a fake identity to gather evidence. Eventually, I replied with a carefully worded message claiming I had no information. The moment I sent it, I knew I had crossed another line. Now I wasn't just keeping the money. I was actively lying about it. A few hours after I sent that reply, the stranger answered. The tone of the message had changed. They weren't angry, but there was a clear sense of desperation behind the words. They explained that the missing money represented years of savings. According to them, the transfer had been made during a stressful period, and a single mistake in the account information had sent it somewhere it was never supposed to go. I remember staring at the screen for a long time. Until then, the money had felt abstract. It was just numbers in an account. A banking error. An opportunity. Now there was a person attached to it. Someone who was worried, frustrated, and trying to fix a problem. For the first time, guilt started competing with greed. I considered telling the truth. I even drafted a response admitting everything. But every version ended with the same fear: if I confessed, what would happen next? So I deleted the draft. Then I stopped replying altogether. The silence protected me from consequences, but it also made me feel like the worst version of myself. After I stopped responding to the emails, I expected the situation to fade away. Instead, it followed me everywhere. I couldn't look at my account balance without thinking about the person on the other side of those messages. Every purchase felt different now. What had once felt exciting started feeling contaminated. The worst part was that I couldn't talk to anyone about it. Friends would complain about work, relationships, or bills, and I'd sit there carrying this secret that seemed to grow heavier every week. I became irritable and withdrawn. People noticed. One evening, a close friend asked me directly whether something was wrong. I almost told him. I even started explaining how a series of bad decisions can trap someone before they realize it. But I stopped myself before revealing the truth. Instead, I laughed it off and changed the subject. Later that night, I realized something unsettling. I had spent so much time worrying about getting caught that I hadn't noticed another consequence. I was slowly becoming someone I didn't recognize anymore. A few weeks later, I came home to find an official-looking envelope waiting in my mailbox. The return address belonged to a law firm. My heart sank. I stood in the hallway for nearly a minute before opening it. Inside was a formal letter stating that funds believed to have been transferred in error were being investigated. The document didn't accuse me of theft directly, but it requested information regarding certain transactions connected to my account. Reading it felt like watching a storm finally arrive after months of dark clouds. The strange thing was that the letter contained very little concrete information. It was mostly procedural language. Yet my mind filled in the gaps. I imagined lawsuits, criminal charges, frozen accounts, and public humiliation. That night I barely touched dinner. I kept rereading the document, looking for reassurance and finding none. For the first time since the money appeared, I seriously considered returning everything that remained. But another problem had emerged. A significant portion of it was already gone. And there was no easy way to undo that. The morning after receiving the letter, I woke up with a headache and a sense of dread that wouldn't go away. For months, I had been operating under the assumption that I could somehow stay ahead of the situation. Now that illusion was gone. I spent the entire weekend reviewing my finances. The numbers were brutal. A large part of the money had been used to pay debts, overdue bills, and living expenses. Some of it had gone toward things I genuinely needed. Some of it hadn't. Either way, the result was the same: I no longer had enough available funds to simply return everything. That realization terrified me. I began exploring every possible way to raise money. I cut unnecessary spending immediately. I looked for additional freelance work. I even considered selling some of my belongings. The irony wasn't lost on me. The transfer that had initially seemed like an escape from financial stress had created a far worse problem. No matter what I did, I couldn't change one simple fact. The money was gone, but the consequences were getting closer. A few days after the letter arrived, I received another message, this time requesting a meeting. It wasn't a demand. Technically, I could have declined. But by then I was exhausted from running scenarios through my head. Every day felt like waiting for a door to open and reveal whatever consequences were coming. Part of me wanted answers, even if they were bad ones. The meeting took place in a small office conference room. I remember arriving early and sitting alone at the table, staring at a glass of water I had no intention of drinking. My hands wouldn't stop moving. When the others entered, nobody raised their voice. Nobody made dramatic accusations. That somehow made the situation worse. They calmly explained that they were tracing the path of the funds and trying to determine exactly what had happened after the transfer. Most of their questions were straightforward. My answers weren't. I avoided direct admissions, chose my words carefully, and tried to sound cooperative. Walking out afterward, I realized something important. The truth was catching up faster than my excuses. The meeting stayed with me for days. What bothered me wasn't the questions. It was the realization that everyone involved already seemed to understand most of the story. They weren't searching for some mysterious culprit anymore. They were trying to determine whether I was willing to be honest. For the first time, I seriously questioned the narrative I had been telling myself. For months, I had framed everything as a misunderstanding that got out of control. But sitting alone in my apartment one evening, I couldn't ignore the facts. The money had arrived unexpectedly. I had known it wasn't mine. And instead of reporting it, I had made a conscious decision to benefit from it. That distinction mattered. The guilt I had been pushing aside finally caught up with me. I stopped sleeping well. I stopped enjoying the things that normally distracted me. Even small conversations felt difficult because my mind kept drifting back to the same question. How much longer was I willing to keep lying? By the end of that week, I knew a decision was coming. And for once, I wasn't thinking about how to protect myself. A few days after reaching that breaking point, I made the hardest decision of the entire ordeal. I stopped trying to defend myself. When I was contacted again, I agreed to speak openly about what had happened. There was no dramatic confession, no emotional speech worthy of a movie. It was much simpler than that. I told the truth. I explained how the transfer had appeared, how I initially convinced myself it might be a mistake that would correct itself, and how that uncertainty slowly turned into rationalization. I admitted that once I understood the money likely belonged to someone else, I continued using it anyway. Saying those words out loud was strangely painful. For months, I had carried the story around in pieces, hiding certain facts even from myself. Speaking honestly forced me to confront the reality of my choices. The reactions were calmer than I expected. Nobody congratulated me for being truthful. Nobody treated me like a victim of circumstances. They simply listened. And in that moment, I understood something important. Admitting the truth doesn't erase the damage you've caused. In the end, I didn't walk away from the situation unchanged. The exact legal and financial consequences took months to sort out. There were difficult conversations, repayment arrangements, and more embarrassment than I care to remember. Every step forced me to confront decisions I had spent a long time trying to justify. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was accepting responsibility. For a while, I wanted to blame my debt, my stress, or the strange circumstances of the transfer itself. Those things influenced my choices, but they didn't make them for me. At every critical moment, I had opportunities to do the right thing, and I chose otherwise. Looking back, what scares me most is how ordinary the process felt. There was no master plan, no dramatic criminal mindset. Just a series of small compromises that gradually became something much bigger. If anyone reading this finds themselves in a situation that seems morally grey, don't rely on your ability to rationalize it. That's a dangerous path. The lesson I learned is simple. When you know something isn't yours, don't build your future on keeping it. The temporary relief is never worth the lasting consequences, and the person you become along the way may be the greatest loss of all.